Hello and welcome to this Retail Systems and InterSystems webinar on smart data management in the age of supply chain disruption. I'm Hannah McGrath, an editor at Retail Systems. And over the course of this webinar, we will focus on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on retail and manufacturing supply chains, as well as the longer-term issues of ensuring data is connected, managed and optimized to help businesses run efficiently and deliver the best possible service to customers. I'm delighted to be joined today by a panel of experts who will share their insights into supply chain management, data, and the wider impact of disruption on the retail and manufacturing industries. They are Maya Knights, a journalist, editor, and research director specializing in enterprise technology use in retail and head of industry insights at Eagle Eye. Next up is Simon Kempston, head of supply chain at AO.com, a major online retailer of electricals based in the UK. Also joining us is Joe Lichtenberg, Director of Product and Industry Marketing at InterSystems. And finally, Gareth Bennett, Head of Product Strategy at OnPrompt. So before we jump into the discussion, let's first take a look at the context in which retailers and manufacturers are currently operating. As the world begins to grapple with the longer-term reality of COVID-19, retailers and manufacturers are reeling from the impact of unprecedented disruption to supply chains at a time of rapidly evolving consumer habits. Some agile businesses have pivoted their model to adapt to changes in supply and demand in this new normal, but many have struggled to maintain relevance in the face of e-commerce giants and major goods manufacturers who are able to use real-time data flows, advanced analytics, and personalization to deliver what their customer wants when they want it. As a result, legacy IT infrastructure is having to work harder than ever to unify the entire supply chain, from warehouse to delivery options and online marketing strategy. And as the mountains of data grow, businesses are finding their information stuck in silos, while fast-moving competitors use artificial intelligence and machine learning to pull ahead with real-time stock visibility, integrated scalability, and seamless customer interaction. The challenge for retail and manufacturing firms is how to seize the opportunities of intelligent data management and use the lessons of COVID-19 to help build their resilience to future disruption. So there's an overview of the state of play for these businesses in the new normal. So now let's ask the experts for their views on these challenges. Let's start with a question about data and supply and demand. Simon, how have businesses harnessed their data to manage changes in supply and demand created by COVID-19 whilst maintaining high levels of customer service?
I think it's interesting there that you've used the word harnessed in there, because obviously along with that I would put the word sharing, which I think is really key to this. So the big thing for us is pulling our data into one place where we can identify the risks and opportunities rather than individual departments forecasting as silos. So bringing together goods in, dispatch, customer experience as a few examples there. And also, ensuring that we're reviewing those forecasts more frequently. So, previously we would have done 6-month forecast, 12-month forecast, and reviewed them monthly. Whereas now, obviously, due to COVID-19, we're actually reviewing our forecasts on a weekly basis, and looking at the trends that we can spot with our own internal data, but looking at external data as well from the likes of GfK and Amdia. And the big thing there for me is around sharing. So, looking at those forecasts and sharing them with suppliers, obviously enabling them to forecast for their factories, because obviously, we could see longer lead times from those factories as we've had less production while retail stores were closed across Europe. And then as all the countries have started to wake up again and people started purchasing, that will obviously put pressure on those factories, which could result in constraints.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that answer, Simon. That's brilliant. And Joe, I wondered whether you could shed some light on how businesses are harnessing their data to manage changes in supply and demand created by COVID-19 and the customer service angle.
Yes, thank you, Hannah. So it hasn't necessarily been easy for a lot of companies. I think for organizations that have cracks and gaps in their processes, that are running the business with spreadsheets, I think many of them have struggled really to match supply with the changes in demand. You have to have trust in the data. Is there enough inventory? Do you really have the inventory that you think you have? Where is it actually located? And that was really compounded by the crisis. For example, when we had commercial demand plummeting from restaurants and hotels while consumer demand was spiking. And so another requirement is around also having the flexibility and the resiliency to be able to adjust to the problems with suppliers and the changes in demand in real time or in near real time with minimal impact to the business and to your customers. So, when data is being managed manually and with spreadsheets, and companies have to do a lot of manual work to compensate for the gaps they have in their data and their processes, it can be really hard to maintain these high levels of customer service. And so since this happened so quickly and with such disruption to normal supply and demand levels, I think most or all companies were affected by this to some extent. So now, as these extreme conditions are starting to get under control for the most part, we do see that more companies are working to address the underlying foundational problems that were exposed by the crisis. So the things that we're seeing now are primarily around data and integrating silos and the accuracy and the visibility of the data. Number one, so that they can maintain a high level of customer service. And then second, so that they can be more responsive going forward. So it doesn't hurt as much the next time, and they have more accurate and current data, and they can eliminate blind spots and wire together processes to start to eliminate some of these gaps and the manual steps that they have, so that their processes are more automated and they can be more resilient and more flexible.
Absolutely. Okay, that's brilliant. And does anybody else have a point to jump in there on changes in supply and demand, or any of the points that were raised by Simon or Joe? No, in which case I think we'll move on to the next question, which is about the crisis accelerating digital transformation efforts for those businesses that are reliant on supply chains. Maya, this is your area of expertise. Could you give me a sense of what's happening in digital transformation of supply chains at the moment?
Yes, thanks, Hannah. I think I would really just like to build on what Simon and Joe have already said. I mean, in order to reach that sort of near real-time data integration and visibility, to achieve the sharing and collaboration of data across supply chains, be more responsive and improve the customer experience, that automation is absolutely key. And that's at the heart of, I think, what the buzzword digital transformation really means. So I think Simon and Joe have already sort of eloquently described some of the impacts, and you can fully understand why that's accelerated digital transformation efforts, because any attempts at further automation using AI, any further attempts to harness data that join up touch points between suppliers and channels and customers that those channels serve, those sales channels serve, as well as marketing channels, really needs that level of autonomy, I suppose, for want of a better word, in order to be able to do the pivots that companies have had to put into practice in order to keep pace with customer demand. I mean, when it comes to supply chains and digital transformation, I think the two key areas have been sort of inventory management and optimization, as I think has already been touched upon, which are mission critical. And you've used the use of advanced analytics to update sort of category and store level sales data, and daily availability forecasts, for example, play an increased role in buying replenishment plans. I think the other angle I've seen is also the agility to be able to also think strategically about where your supply chains are based, to be able to outsource quickly. So that's not just sharing with existing suppliers, but being able to spin up and spin down new suppliers quickly. I think that's, in terms of resilience and recovery, is going to be a key factor in terms of digital transformation efforts for businesses, all businesses that business consumer facing supply chains.
Brilliant. And do you see this situation as a bit of a silver lining? Perhaps businesses were struggling to make the case for digital transformation beforehand, and this has made it very plain that it's essential rather than just sort of an optional extra.
I think, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Perhaps a better way of thinking about it from a human nature angle would be that necessity is the mother of all invention, and I think a lot of business to consumer operations have spun up some innovations in record time that, given normal life, probably would have taken a lot longer. And I think being able to harness the processes as well as the data and the technology and the people that go around that, and understand how they've been able to make those achievements, achieve those innovations so quickly, in order to meet customer demand, being able to spin up click and collect, being able to increase their delivery capacity, and their picking capacity, for example. Looking at those processes are going to be very, very important alongside the data and the technologies that they've used.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Maya. And Gareth, I wonder whether you could shed some light on the digital transformation angle in terms of data and supply chains on the supply side.
Absolutely, yeah. I think accelerated is definitely the key word here, and it really has. I think Joe was touching upon blind spots, and unfortunately this crisis has really put a spotlight for many businesses and many business leaders on their gaps and their weaknesses within some of their mission critical processes, and they've either had to, I think, accelerate some plans, or even not even accelerate perhaps, but start considering digital transformation plans in some cases, in order to try and plug those gaps and give themselves some resilience. But also many organizations, as we're all pretty aware of, are having to shift and adapt very, very quickly to perhaps changes in consumer behavior. For one thing, B2B, for example, from my perspective, B2B e-commerce is on the in terms of adoption and interest is significantly going up as organizations are trying to lean out their particular processes, offer better experience, and try and learn from a B2C environment. We've got, if I can give some examples, for organizations, for example, and I think Joe was referencing this about manual processes, where we went from office-based, we had a pretty consistent process and a way of working, to unfortunately having to respond to this pandemic, move to remote working. And for many of organizations that I speak to, and for example, CPG suppliers as one group, all of a sudden enormous levels of increase in demand, and not having the flexibility potentially, or the scalability to handle that. 48% increase in sales in 1 week alone. Others was 400% increase in sales, and I've got another statistic which is 290% increase in units sold. This is almost happening overnight. It was like Christmas on steroids, week on week for many of these people, and not having the technology platforms underpinning those critical processes that obviously eventually support fulfillment, support experience, where they were not present. A light was on those very, very quickly, and absolutely that has accelerated, I think, digital transformation, because the need is there.
Fantastic. Okay, so Christmas on steroids for supply chains is a very interesting angle, and I'm sure that this is something that perhaps Simon you found as well. This sort of sudden shift in what you need to prioritize at times like this.
Yeah, exactly. And our CEO has been quite famous for saying that there was 5 years of change in 5 weeks during the initial start of the crisis. I'm sure that statement can be updated by JR, given how long we've been in this period. But yes, I think the Maya alluded to resilience, which I think has been shown in buckets by so many people, and having to down tools and leave the office with a moment's notice to then turn your home into your working environment, shows how resilient people's got to be, kind of clashing their home and their their work life together. So yeah, it's just huge. And as you say, you know, Christmas on steroids. You know, for us, it's that view of, you know, what is peak going to look like this year. So what will you know, Black Friday and Christmas trading look like?
Yeah, and I think, you know, for a lot of retailers, it's a lot of pressure on their systems and a lot of pressure on their staff, and you know, it's really impressive to see how quickly people have pivoted, and that transitions us quite nicely on to the next question, which is about manufacturers and retailers leveraging existing data to power AI projects whilst working remotely. There, you know, there's a lot of digital projects which have had to be undertaken whilst staff are working from perhaps their own devices or certainly remotely. Joe, could you shed a light on the challenges in terms of leveraging data that those present?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, you know, AI and machine learning, obviously it's a huge initiative right now. But I do think it's more of a data issue and also a scarcity of skills issue than it is necessarily a remote access issue, at least from our perspective. So I will tell you that all of the companies that we work with, they all want to be more data driven, and they all want to use AI and analytics for better decisions and scenario planning and, you know, predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics. But I will tell you that, you know, as much as it's top of mind right now, we see it still being fairly early, AI and machine learning on the adoption curve. And from our perspective, we see a number of factors that are constraining adoption. One is that you need access to integrated, consistent, well-structured data that's combined from different sources inside and outside the organization. And then, you know, you need to take it and massage it into a format so that you can actually use it. And you also need lots of data, lots of good data, if you really want to get good results from machine learning and AI projects. And so I will tell you that this is something actually that we do a lot with our customers. And we have a pretty pragmatic approach to doing this. So what we do is we'll work with companies to integrate the different systems and different silos from inside the company and, you know, from outside the firewall and working with their partners, really first to help with visibility and around streamlining and automating processes, which is really, you know, what we've been talking about on this call. But then as a byproduct, and a really valuable byproduct of all of this work, is that when all of this data flows through these new composite services, these streamlined processes that cross system boundaries, and all of that data now is integrated and transformed into a consistent format. If you store all that data and you maintain all of that data, you have this clean production historical data that is stored in the database, and, you know, that's really, you know, the value in the organization. So now you can start to take this data that you've captured just through, you know, having better visibility and smarter processes, and you can run analytics on it to improve the business, right? So, you know, can I optimize my inventory levels and minimize safety stock so that I can save money? Can I cluster my stores that are similar so that I can find the underperforming outliers and then compare them with the overachieving stores? And, you know, can I make the underachieving stores perform better just by making small changes? How do I optimize promotions, right? So those are the kinds of things that our customers are doing when they have access to this good historical production data. Just very quickly, the other thing that I want to talk about is that you know, what we see is there's also clearly a skills shortage for data scientists. And this is especially true as you move down market from the very largest organizations. And so I think this is you know, another really big reason that even though firms, they know a lot of the things that they want to do around machine learning and predictive analytics, but they're not further along than they want to be. And so one approach obviously is just go out and hire more data scientists, but, you know, obviously that's not that easy. They're hard to find, they're very expensive. But what I want to talk about is what's happening now is that there are a number of technology companies, including ours, that are offering what's called Auto ML, AUTO ML. And with this sort of newer Auto ML technology, you don't necessarily need to be a data scientist to build these accurate machine learning models. It's very exciting. As long as you have access to enough accurate historical data, the software can take all of the data and churn through all of the different kinds of algorithms and parameters and hyperparameters and so on, and return, for many kinds of cases, a pretty accurate model that solves for what you're looking to do. So, an example might be to provide all the data that you want to optimize for the ideal price point to maximize the profit for one product, for one SKU, based on a lot of data, right? So on a year of sales history in all 5,000 different stores and online channels, different locations. And then you want to do that not just for one SKU, but you want to do that for thousands of SKUs, right? So that's a lot of data to sift through with lots of columns and different attributes that may or may not be relevant to the analysis. So it's hard, but that's exactly what these Auto ML technologies do. They do the brute force calculations, and they identify what are the most relevant features that you need to use from the data. What are the best algorithms? How do you get the highest accuracy in terms of tuning the algorithms? But you do need the data to feed it. And that's why having access to this clean data and lots of data is so important. So again, that's where we see sort of the state of AI and ML. But I think there are some really exciting things that are happening now with technology that's making it easier for companies to leverage.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were hearing about automation and this idea of churning through data, but it has to be quality data. It has to be clean in order for you to get the outcomes you want. And that there are, software and technologies available that can help businesses do that. I want to look now at the biggest challenges that supply chain companies are seeing in trying to unify and monetize data across the business at a time of disruption. I wonder, Simon, could you shed some light on that from AO.com's perspective?
Sure. I suppose one of the biggest challenges is that there's lots of different areas impacted by lots of different things all happening at the same time. So, I mentioned earlier, a few departments like goods in, dispatch, customer experience, you've also got finance in there. You've also got the people pulling together the forecasts. So, it's just huge. It's so sizable. The impact that that's having on all those areas. And the big thing is obviously, identifying the risk to the business if the forecasts are wrong. So if we're investing in additional warehousing and we're investing in additional fleet, and obviously if the forecasts are not realised, what is the risk to the business from a cash perspective? And I think it's something that Joe alluded to earlier. It's trusting the data is really key. I think for all departments, people can spend quite a lot of time going around the houses with the data and the various what-if scenarios. But at the moment, we're in quite a fast-paced world where we have to trust it and we have to move fairly quickly. Otherwise, we'll get left behind. So I think, as I alluded to earlier, we're quite fortunate. We have one team pulling these forecasts together that can take into account, all the different scenarios that will be happening with those different departments. So we can, look at the scenarios collectively and come up with solutions and work out, where our largest risks are. But I think, the other challenge is, being as open and honest as you can be, especially with suppliers. We all need, to increase our availability and maintain that availability, because the big thing there for us is obviously the business from our customers, which we'll only get through, the great experience that they've, come to expect from AO.com. But also by ensuring, that the products are there, so they'll come back to us the second time, the third time, and the fourth time.
Absolutely. So it's making sure that your data is not just unified, but it's really accurate and real time, so that you can meet customer demand wherever it is, whenever it is. That's a really interesting point. And Joe, just sort of circling back on that there, is that something that resonates with you as well? This idea of not only unifying but also ensuring that you've got real time data to deal with disruption.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's critical. I think Simon and Gareth and Maya all made really valid points. I mean, one is just being able to do this in a time of disruption where you have to keep all the trains moving on time. So I think that just compounds it. But very much around what Simon talked to, where you have many different data sources and systems, and you need to have confidence in the data. I want to know how much inventory I have on the shelf or in the warehouse or in the store now. So I agree. From our perspective, the data silos, the data dispersion problem is absolutely one of the bigger challenges, and it's not just integration, it's real-time data. I will give you one quick example from one of our customers in the industry. So they're a pretty large 3PL servicing the retail industry, and they had exactly that problem. And so when they first came to us a few years ago, the problem, two main problems among others. One is that they had lots of blind spots in their customers' processes. And so, everything was reactive, and they were hearing about, problems from the retail client or from the retail client's customers, which is usually pretty problematic. And sometimes it took as long as 6 months to fully onboard and integrate a new retail client. And so those were the two main problems that they were looking to fix. And so, I mean, I will just say that technology has come a long way. And with the advent of new approaches to integration and data management platforms and API first development and API management, between technology and advances in development methodologies, companies are able to, really address these problems proactively. So for this particular customer, they were able to eliminate many of the blind spots, and and it's an ongoing process as their business evolves. And they have these highly customized dashboards with real-time data for their internal people, as well as for different roles in each of their client accounts. And then the thing that was really valuable for them is they say they were able to cut the time to onboard a new customer from 6 months, which was crazy, to 2 days. And so, what they tell us is what that meant for the business was that it was really transformational in terms of being able to respond to requirements from their customers, and in terms of allowing their existing customers to be more flexible and more resilient with their business partners and their networks.
Sure.
And so obviously, and I was just going to say, obviously, in times of crisis, this flexibility is especially important.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing that across many different industries at the moment and different sectors. And you mentioned their blind spots, and that raises the topic of a 360-degree view of customers and a supply chain, actually. Maya, I wonder, could you tell me a bit about the importance of a 360-degree view of your customers and the supply chain across different channels, and how is this changing customer engagement and delivery?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I need to unpack it a bit, though, in terms of what do we mean by a 360-degree view of the customer. So I think Joe and Simon's last comments have really queued that up nicely, where we characterize businesses as kind of drowning in data. I mean, Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella said at NRF in January that retail generates, I think it's 40 terabytes of data an hour. And often retailers say that they are drowning in data, and it's often yeah, again, what Joe was saying, you know, what you're asking of that data, if you're putting bad data in, you're going to get bad insights out. But from a customer perspective, I think there are a proliferation of touch points, which goes hand in hand with businesses need to digitally transform their businesses, because these trends are digitally enabled and data driven. And if I take a step back, I think maybe picking up on one of the points of your questions earlier, those that have done well were already well on their way from a digital transformation perspective, in terms of surviving the impacts, being resilient and recovering quickly from the impacts of the pandemic. And when I look at those digitally enabled and data-driven businesses, they are customer driven. They have customer demand driven supply chains, and those businesses are able to share that data and those trends and plug those trends into their forecasts to create meaningful insights that can drive actions within upstream and downstream in their supply chains to help them anticipate demand. And the important thing there is that the customer data points have proliferated. And so you might know a customer that comes into your store. Well, you're unlikely to know a customer that comes into your store, particularly if they're anonymous, one-time cash paying, but you're likely to have a digital relationship with them, particularly for many for a first time during the pandemic when non-essential stores were closed, for example. I think an interesting illustration of this was a US survey done at the beginning of the pandemic, where by LEK Consulting, where they found that 18% of respondents deeming the severity of COVID-19 most critical were spending 17% more by stockpiling. Spending actually dropped, but there was a disproportionate amount of stockpiling by a small number of customers. Now, if a retailer or any business was able to see that in real time, monitor that in real time, understand who those customers were, cater to them in real time, and share that data amongst their suppliers, it would help them to pivot and react in a much more strategic rather than tactical way. And I think that, to Joe's point about data dispersion, these touch points are everywhere. So being able to join up those touch points, have a unified 360-degree view of the customer is absolutely key. How does that change customer engagement and delivery? It means I can send people that have tried to get a delivery slot with me a voucher for click and collect, to incentivize them to collect. If I have a loyalty scheme, I can leverage that. If I have a subscription scheme, I leverage that. If I don't, I can use promotions to leverage that. So I can also try and affect customer demand or influence and incentivize customer demand, as well as having to deal with the peaks, the unseasonal peaks in demand that have come about as part of the pandemic. So the 360 degree of the customer is absolutely key. Hopefully I've unpacked what that means and why that's so important.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, it's fascinating, that point there, that you can actually use that data to come up with new incentives, which could potentially also alter the supply and demand scenario as well. So it allows, you know, if you've got good data, you can look at the customer and know from a 360-degree perspective what they want and when they want it. You can then not only anticipate their interest in your product, but you can also change the demand dynamic, which is really interesting. Gareth, I wonder whether you have any you've got a point to make on this from the supply side. You know, a 360-degree view. What does that mean for the supply chain, and how does that then feed into customer engagement?
Yeah, if I just pick up on, I'll certainly come to that. If I may just pick up on just some of the points that was Maya was making, and perhaps add to those a little bit, which is that and I can't talk with too much authority about obviously the end consumer side of things, apart from being one. That's not my area of expertise. But in terms of approaching these kinds of projects or initiatives around trying to better understand the customer, is in what do they want, is one question. What do they need is a totally separate question, but an important one. And what data points are available to us or could be obtained that help us understand what we flushed out through the first two questions and drive the necessary improvements. And I think blending across from, sort of as I've been listening to many of the responses to the previous questions, I think what we're going through at the moment is we're really understanding, and what is, not use that word accelerate again, but what's certainly been accelerated is understanding how in particular consumer behavior is changing, not even just the products they want, but the service that they're after and how they want that service delivered. And if we actually look a little bit outside retail and just step into food service, particularly here in the UK, where we've seen independent restaurateurs and we've seen larger organizations and pub chains and such like offering online services, be they apps that help you once you're actually on premises or away from premises. We've certainly seen an uptake in deliveries, home deliveries from restaurants and things, that people have gone digital. And many people are saying, well, why did they never do this before? Because they weren't asking perhaps those questions of their customers, and they weren't considering it from that perspective. So I just want to sort of add to that I think it's the questions that you ask as well that are trying to give you that 360-degree view is an important one to see how things have changed, as well as obviously the absolute fundamentals. What are they buying? When are they buying it? And how can we influence behavior in certain ways? But to come from the supply side, so working from the suppliers into those particular retailers. Absolutely. I mean, it goes without saying that retailers want the best visibility over their supplier community as they possibly can, and many struggle to achieve that at the moment. And it does come back to many of the sort of core points that have been raised, particularly by Joe, which is around the data, the quality of the data, or potentially in certain scenarios the lack of it, or maybe a little bit in between, which is actually how that data is being presented, which is sometimes very difficult to actually capture and utilize. And in terms of how does it improve customer engagement and delivery, well, as a supplier, if the supplier can work in a much more collaborative way, and I do think it's only taken a pandemic potentially to drive people towards greater levels of collaboration, but if they can work in a more collaborative way with their retail customers, and their retailer customers obviously likewise feeding back the information, that will certainly support the better on-shelf availability, because ultimately if the supplier's responsibility now, in my personal view, is that they're not going to get it right every time. There are going to be bumps along the way in terms of satisfying particular orders and demand, but clear and timely communication, early warning, as best possible to those issues into their customers, into those retailers, is the best thing that they can do, because those retailers, and I think this is maybe what was from Mayo's perspective, is that they can adapt and plan and respond much more effectively if they know. If they don't know, of course they're walking blind into a problem which the end consumer will unfortunately feel the brunt of. So in terms of, from my perspective, it's understanding what data could a supplier facilitate to their retail customers in a way that the retail customers can actually utilize, and likewise, what actually can those retailers bring to the table that are going to allow their suppliers to better work together, and ultimately they're trying to achieve the same goal and rally around the same flag, so to speak, about serving that end customer. But it's certainly been an interesting one, because with, in particular, at the height of the pandemic, when SKU lines were being discontinued because production runs were just going on core lines full tilt for days and weeks on end with no breathers. There was no time to even change production lines. It was just deliver core product, and the retailers, in particular in grocery retail, screaming out for visibility. This is all of a sudden, here's this crazy forecast coming across. When you're going to deliver it? When you're going to deliver it? It's a difficult ask to meet, but coming to the table with information and data that helps them understand where you are in terms of trying to fulfill that demand. It might not exactly what they want to hear, but it's certainly a very, very important step for that retailer in order to understand what they need to do to get product on the shelf. And I think I haven't got the quotes to hand, but I think Tesco's were in the press. I think being quite here in the UK, we're being quite complimentary of some of their suppliers who have stepped up in that way, because they've helped them really get through what for many obviously organizations has been extremely difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this idea that collaboration has long been something that that supply chain partners have wanted to do, but this has absolutely necessitated it. That's a really interesting point. Joe, I wondered, do you have anything to add there in terms of what a 360-degree view can add, and how it can change customer engagement as well? How you're delivering for customers.
I do. I think there was a lot there from both Maya and Gareth. So, obviously we agree this is really, really important, and we really see that as table stakes, or the sort of the entry level as companies start to have access to accurate data and real-time data, and having more confidence in the data across multiple sources. So, right, I mean, one is about visibility, right? I mean, that's the 360-degree accurate real-time view. But I just really want to echo the importance of using data to drive the business for better decision support, and so on. And so the kinds of things that we've been talking about in terms of having the data as a byproduct, and then being able to use that to analyze it to really understand the business and make good business decisions. The other thing, though, that I want to point out, I want to mention, when you talk about how it can change customer engagement and delivery, the real-time aspect is not just in terms of having access to data from inside and outside your firewall in real time, but it's also being able to leverage it from our perspective with real-time processes and real-time visibility into what's happening. So contextually, what's happening with your customers, either in the stores or less so now in during the pandemic, but what's happening online, augmenting that with real-time data from other external sources, so that you can be as contextually appropriate with real-time data to really create an outstanding customer experience and maximize customer engagement. And so if you think about that, right, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts to that. Part of that is, control tower and visibility and integration and access to various data sources. Part of it is the processes themselves, but part of it is to have these processes that can react in real time to changes in the external environment and to customer behavior. And so, that in large part is, where organizations and we see, more and more supply chain VPs implementing, not just off-the-shelf systems, but really looking at data management platforms to help them unify the data from across these silos, and not only provide the single source of truth to the business with accuracy and low latency, and to drill into the data and ask questions of the data, but to be able to programmatically sort of optimize the experience in real time. And the different analysts have different sort of ratings in terms of the maturity level. And so It's still somewhere less than 50% of organizations that have sort of gotten their heads around all of these moving parts to make all of that happen. But that's absolutely, sort of the goal throughout the industry. And as we were talking about earlier, what we are seeing is that the pandemic and this disruption has really sort of accelerated those efforts. And Maya was talking about that earlier. And the firms that were already down that road are able to move faster, but we see more and more firms now sort of starting to get their heads around what they need to be able to do to be able to take advantage of that.
Sure, sure. I mean that's a really important point there, that those that were already on the path have found this transition a lot easier than perhaps those who have had their hand forced somewhat. And that takes us nicely onto our final question. About moving parts and how you scale given the circumstances. When responding to demand spikes, which I know, Simon, you mentioned earlier, how are firms scaling appropriately in the current context?
I think the important part to add to that question is how are firms scaling safely? Because obviously, I know that lockdown restrictions are being eased at the moment, but COVID-19 could be back at any point in time, and we have to go back to lockdown and working through those tougher safety environments that we have. So it's all about still maintaining the socially distant environment within our warehouses, because the easy thing is obviously to throw money at it. So open more warehouses. We have done just that. At the beginning of 2020 we had 2 warehouses, and since April we've opened an additional 2 warehouses. And I don't think it'll stop there. So we've ordered a fleet of additional delivery vehicles and looking at additional outbases, so that we're not putting too much into each one, which again allows for the safer working conditions and the safer deliveries. It's interesting that the guys obviously were talking around automation, and within our systems we're trying to automate as much as we can. But while you're automating, you're also taking people away from their day-to-day role. So at the same time as putting more automation in, we've also recruited additional planners. And you yourself, Hannah, mentioned collaboration. It's really important to collaborate with suppliers. We actually have weekly meetings with the majority of our suppliers, and they are called collaboration meetings, where the planners get together with the relevant manufacturers to talk about the various scenarios that we have and also that they have, and it's all about that collaboration that gets us the best availability, whilst also getting the most out of those manufacturing factories. It's constantly reviewing the market data, the information, as I talked about earlier, like GfK, Amdia, spotting the trends that they're seeing. Are we seeing the same trends? And if we're not, why not? Is that something that is going to come to us later? And that's around the more forecasts that we do, providing different scenarios to the business, helps the business to have more confidence in what we're doing. It's also around, trusting the data that I alluded to earlier. But so many people, use a forecasting system that still insist on checking what the system says, rather than, allowing the system to do what it's been designed. Joe talked earlier around, you put good data in, you'll get good data out. So that's the key to this. So don't be afraid to trust the system and let it do what it's designed to do. And the big thing for me there is around planning ahead. So I think that's really important. The further out that we plan, the better. AO came into this year with great growth. On top of that, we then had the coronavirus impact. We're now planning for peak. So looking at Black Friday and Boxing Day. And then I'm sure this will be a subject for another webinar, but then we've also got Brexit as well. So quite a lot of things coming to us all at the same time, which will place huge capacity constraints on supply chains. But the more we collaborate, the easier it will be to get through it.
Absolutely. It sounds like there's a very busy time coming up for you, Simon.
Indeed.
Yeah, and Maya, I wondered if you had any any thing to add on the spotting trends and forecasting point there? I know that that's something that you sort of tend to look at in your work as well.
Yes, absolutely. So from a trends perspective, I think it's nice to be able to follow Simon, who's actually at the coalface doing it, because I think he's ticked all the boxes from a high level strategic trends point of view that I wanted to point to, which was 3 R's, nice and memorable: risk, resilience, and recovery. So again, hats off to Simon as a retailer for highlighting safety as being the key priority here. But when I think about that from a risk perspective, businesses are looking to secure their cash bases. I think we've seen some really good examples on the part of, say, some of the big grocers in the UK assuring supplier payments. I think that's going to be absolutely key there in terms of scaling appropriately, then building that resilience. So Simon pointed to adding scale, adding volume and capacity to their supply chain, to AO's supply chain. That's one way of building the resilience. I think digital transformation and accelerating those efforts is going to be another, being able to connect up customer touch points and have much more of a customer demand driven supply chain is going to be absolutely important there. Picking up on the point that Gareth raised about what questions should you ask for the data, I did want to just and also say to answer a point that Joel made as well. I think I absolutely agree. What questions do you ask when you're talking about data dispersion, drowning in data? One way of cutting through that is to really hone in on what are those questions that you really need answering, and looking at what data points are going to help you answer those. I think, what am I trying to say? Essentially, if I'm a grocer, I'm interested in what you buy and how frequently. I don't need to necessarily know what your favorite color is, but if I'm a fashion retailer, it might be a good idea to know when your birthday is, what your gender is, and what your favorite color might be for a buying planning perspective. So there's a really good little acronym that I've learned from the Tesco Clubcard dunnhumby days, which really I think is a great example that we can sort of learn lessons from, maybe updated to the lens of e-commerce and Amazon. But it was DIAL, which stands for Data Driving Insight to promote action that actually then in turn drives customer loyalty. I think driving customer loyalty is going to be absolutely key. So scaling in that context, if I'm seeing new customers, how can I get them online? How can I get them to come back into my store? If I'm a hospitality business and someone's ordered from me for delivery for the first time, how do I get them to come and dine in with me, for example? So it's what are you measuring? And those kinds of metrics, I think, are going to be absolutely key to recovery. And finally, I'd say that, as we're looking forward to peak, I think we're going to see a lot of the categories that have already enjoyed explosive growth through the pandemic continue to do so. So I think all very well having a good years of historical data to apply auto ML, for example, to. But if that year's data has been radically skewed by the last 6 months, for example, I think there's going to need to be some tweaking of forecasts from that perspective, knowing what's gone for the last 6 months in terms of the fact that home categories, home electronics, home fitness, entertainment have won out, but fashion hasn't done so well. So I think those kind of decisions and factors are going to be important as well as it comes through to Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and through to Christmas and New Year sales.
Brilliant. Okay, so looking ahead into the future and seeing challenges for different sectors as well. And finally, Gareth, I wondered, do you have a sort of a perspective on this from the suppliers and data point of view? How are supply chain managers dealing with demand spikes and looking at scaling? Because it looks like, for example, online businesses such as AO.com are doing a really good job of trying to flex. But it must be a challenge for slightly yet less digitally sort of agile businesses.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a question of digital maturity, and an organisation like AO.com is extremely well positioned to, although they wouldn't, extremely well positioned to react to this situation. I think because of obviously the fundamentals of the organisation is digital. It is an online platform. I think where many traditional supply chain organisations are still working in perhaps the old way, which has been established for 20 or so odd years. And of course, technologies have been brought into these organisations, but at their heart, they're still quite manual in the way that they operate and think, and still Excel driven. Then these demand spikes, and I think this is actually cycling back to maybe some of the points I made on the first one of the first questions, or the second question, was that those with technology in place, in particular in their fulfillment processes, their order management processes, were able to much better respond to the demand. Those that, again, were still quite manual and hadn't really got digital solutions in place were struggling, and of course you have hands on the keyboard and you can only scale that so quickly. In particular, that's very, very difficult in a remote working setting as well. So yeah, demand spikes, I think, put a spotlight on some of these weaknesses within the organization that do highlight lack of flexibility, lack of scalability. And in order to get around that, obviously there's lots of avenues to take. But I think cloud technologies have a huge part to play, and leveraging the scalability of cloud. And we have to be careful when we say resilience, because of course everything is not everything is 100%, but is more likely to be able to absorb some of the pressures that are brought on by the things that we've seen. I think looking at organizations having to put some of their digital sort of glasses and thinking on, and start looking at best of breed technologies. There's definitely, in supply chain organizations now, there's no one technology that's going to solve all your problems. At the heart of many organizations for so long has been the ERP, but the ecosystem that sits around a core ERP now is ever more impressive and ever more accessible, and often predominantly cloud. So looking at what are the best of breed technologies that are best suited for that particular task, and how does that give me scalability and flexibility? Because don't forget, obviously you implement technology, but it will have to change. It will have to adapt to your business as things change. So over time. So having those considerations when looking. Other avenues include outsourcing. That could be outsourcing operations to a separate organization that obviously you just literally lift and shift, or it could be outsourcing in terms, again, from a digital perspective, and allowing organizations, supply chain organizations, to really focus on what they do best. And if they're not a technology outfit, which they're not, they're there to facilitate demand and fulfill demand, then allow them to focus on that. And so actually bringing in partners that are really best placed to support and looking at it from that perspective. But just a final one, maybe, if I had to add to this, which is in-house as well is certainly an option, and we see centres of excellence starting to permeate through. They're not just reserved for the big players. They're starting to permeate through into other organisations, or having digital teams, SWAT teams, agile teams that are available to go around the business and implement particular point solutions, for example, or act as an advisory service, or support with buying processes, those kinds of things. And there's lots of organizations with, I think Joe was referencing this earlier, in terms of the talent that organizations need to bring in. The digital digital talent, or having that angle to it, and thinking with a digital hat on now, and coming in and creating, creating solutions using tools that can be accessible, and don't have huge IT overheads, but can quickly streamline, maybe much more tactical. These might be very small and tactical, but if you chip away at those, then collectively, that can have a big impact and allow organizations to ultimately be able to scale, and to also get the headspace and the breathing space to take a step back and look at the bigger picture, and reevaluate what's going on. That's half the battle sometimes, is just heads are down, just trying to get through the day, survive this moment in time, and just take a step back and look at something strategically is we shouldn't underestimate. Sometimes that's very difficult to do. So
Yeah.
from my perspective, lots of different options to respond.
Lots of different solutions, and certainly the key point of the bigger picture, and hopefully we've explored both the technical aspects and the bigger picture going forward over the past hour or so. So thank you so much for that, Gareth, and thanks everyone. That's a great ending for the discussion. I hope you agree it's been an excellent exploration of the challenges and opportunities of intelligent data management across supply chains in the current COVID-19 context. I'd like to say a big thank you to our panelists, Maya, Simon, Joe and Gareth, for such a wide-ranging discussion, and thanks also to InterSystems for kindly sponsoring this webinar. If you would like to find out more about Retail Systems webinars, please visit retail-systems.com and click the Contact Us page. And please do join us for future webinars on topics in retail technology. Until then, goodbye, and thanks very much for listening. Goodbye.